My mother-in-law called me dead weight after my husband passed. Now she pays monthly rent to the woman she tried to erase from his will. The morning he died, I made peppermint tea like I always did. The house was quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels like peace, but the kind that feels like absence. Like something had been removed suddenly, permanently, and the air hadn't adjusted yet. Ethan passed away at 3:27 a.m. I was sitting right beside him holding his hand when it happened. 1 minute he was here barely, but still breathing, and then he wasn't. His fingers went cold in mine, like a leaf curling under frost. I didn't cry. I thought I was ready. The doctors had been honest. He didn't have much time left after the last round of chemo. But no one's ever really ready. We never had kids. 2 miscarriages and a quiet mutual decision to stop trying. He was all I had, and I was all he had. At least that's what I believed. His mother never liked me. I knew that from the beginning. I wasn't who she pictured for her only son. She told Ethan once loud enough for me to hear that I was dead weight, no lineage, no money, no future. But Ethan always defended me, always took my side, even when it was silent, even when it was just a long look across the room, while she picked me apart over dinner. I lived off those looks. They were my proof that someone saw me, that someone chose me. The funeral was simple, just like he wanted. I didn't say much. I couldn't. My chest felt hollow, but the whispers behind me were sharp. She didn't even shed a tear. She probably wanted this to be over. I didn't answer them. I didn't owe them anything. I'd been there for every scan, every vomit-soaked sheet, every moment Ethan forgot what year it was. I shaved my head when he lost his so he wouldn't feel alone. I bathed him when he couldn't lift his arms. I gave up my job, my whole career, really to stay with him full-time. And now he was gone. 3 days later, Judith, his mother, called me into the living room. Her voice had that clipped, brittle sharpness she always used with people she didn't respect. "You'll need to start packing," she said, not looking up from the papers in her lap. "The house isn't yours to stay in anymore." I didn't say anything. I just looked at her and then at the wedding photo, still hanging by the fireplace, Ethan and I on the beach in Mendocino. His arm around my waist like I was his whole world. Judith didn't follow my gaze. Her eyes stayed on the documents. "The estate," she said, as if she were explaining weather. "It's been placed in a trust, and I'm the acting executor. You weren't included in the revised will." I still didn't speak. I already knew. I knew Ethan wasn't lucid enough to revise anything in those last weeks. And I knew Judith. I knew the kind of lawyers she hired. The kind that specialized in quiet removals. The kind that made people like me disappear without headlines. She handed me a printed notice, an official letter from a firm downtown, claiming the house now belonged to the trust. Her name stamped cleanly across the bottom.
I left that afternoon. 1 suitcase, a few of Ethan's letters, nothing else, no hug, no goodbye, no thank you. Just the slow sound of the front door clicking shut behind me.
She thought she'd erased me, that I'd slink away defeated, forgotten. That's what people like her always believe. But Judith never knew who I was before I met Ethan. She never asked what I'd walked away from to be his caregiver. She never saw me as anything but background. And that, more than anything, is why she made her biggest mistake. Because while she was celebrating her silent victory, I was remembering everything I'd given up and quietly deciding what I was going to take back. I moved into a short-term rental across town, 1 bedroom, 2nd floor. The kind of place that smells like old carpet no matter how many candles you burn. I couldn't sleep the first few nights, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was silent in a different way. Not the echo of absence, but something more vacant. Like I no longer belonged to anyone or anywhere. I spent those nights replaying everything: how Ethan and I met, the years we spent building something soft and private. How we used to drive north with no destination just to feel the quiet along the Pacific coast. The way he used to tuck my hair behind my ear when I got lost in thought. It was the smallest gestures that hurt the most to remember. But in those memories, something else started surfacing. I remembered what I gave up. I'd been working for a healthcare nonprofit when Ethan got sick. I'd just been promoted director of partnerships. It was the first time I felt like I had something of my own, something no one gave me. When the diagnosis came, I didn't even hesitate. I left it all behind. It's just a pause, I told myself. He needs me more. That pause turned into 5 years. 5 years of insurance battles, chemo schedules, emergency room visits at 3 a.m. I became an expert in medications I couldn't pronounce. I tracked white blood cell counts like it was a second job. And somewhere along the way, I disappeared. Judith didn't see any of it. She showed up at the hospital sometimes, made sure the nurses knew who she was. She'd bring Ethan smoothies and gifts from the golf club ladies. But she never stayed long. And she never looked at me. Once when Ethan was sleeping, I heard her talking to a nurse outside his room. "She's not really family," Judith said, like I wasn't 10 feet away behind a thin curtain. "I don't know how she ended up here, but she's not permanent." I should have stood up then. I should have said something, but I didn't. I was too tired, too full of fear. I'd already convinced myself that none of it mattered as long as Ethan still reached for my hand in the dark. But now that he was gone, I was starting to see things differently. I pulled out the medical power of attorney papers one night. My name had been on everything until 2 months before he passed. That was when the notary visited the house when Judith started handling things. Ethan had been on heavy medication by then, barely able to stay awake. I remembered the way his hand trembled when he tried to sign. I remember Judith standing behind him, hand on his shoulder, guiding him like a child. I'd told myself it was grief, that she was just scared of losing her son, that she didn't mean to push me out. But it wasn't grief. It was calculation. And now she had everything. The house, the investment accounts, the vehicles. Even Ethan's old sailboat, which hadn't left the marina in years, but held all our summer memories. Everything was in her name or in the trust she controlled. And I was expected to disappear with nothing but silence. I could have left it there. I almost did. But one morning I was walking past a bookstore and saw a book in the window. It wasn't the title that caught me, it was the dedication. For the ones who stayed when no one clapped for them. It stopped me cold. I stood there, hand pressed to the glass, realizing something I hadn't let myself believe. Until that moment, I mattered. What I gave mattered. And if no one else was going to stand up for that, I would. Not out of revenge, out of restoration. I didn't want Judith to suffer. I wanted what was mine. What Ethan would have given me if he'd had the strength to fight her. I started quietly. I looked up estate laws, trust structures. I reached out to a former co-worker whose husband specialized in probate litigation. I gathered every document I still had. Ethan's letters, texts, appointment records, prescriptions. I wasn't trying to build a case yet. I just wanted to remember who I had been. Not the woman they erased. The woman who endured. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not the barista who started memorizing my coffee order, not the woman across the hall who kept leaving soup outside my door. Not even my sister who called once a week from Montana, asking if I was really okay. I let them all believe I was healing. But I wasn't healing. Not yet. I was collecting. There were so many little moments I'd ignored when Ethan was alive. Moments that didn't feel like betrayals until they stacked up high enough to block the light. Like how Judith would intercept the mail saying she was helping with the bills, or how she insisted on handling all the legal documents after Ethan's second surgery, because you're too emotional to read the fine print. How she'd walk into our bedroom like it still belonged to her. At the time, I convinced myself that if I pushed back, it would just cause Ethan more stress. So I let it go. Again and again. But grief rewrites memory. It clarifies. One afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office. I asked to see the most recent version of Ethan's will. The clerk pulled it up without hesitation. It was public record once the estate went into probate. And there, in clean digital print, was the date just 6 weeks before he died. I remembered that day. Ethan couldn't get out of bed. His vision had started to blur. He'd asked me to read to him because he couldn't focus on the words. He didn't write that will. He didn't even know what day it was. But someone filed it. Someone notarized it. Someone signed on his behalf. My hands didn't shake, not right away. I just stared at the signature. I knew Ethan's handwriting. I knew the soft tilt of his E, the long tail of his H. This one was rushed, unfamiliar, mechanical. I printed a copy and folded it into my bag. My heart didn't race. My breath stayed steady, but something in me had shifted. Not like a crack, more like a lock sliding into place. Judith hadn't just taken the house. She'd taken his voice. She'd turned his death into an opportunity, and I had proof. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment and opened a blank notebook. On the first page, I wrote one word: restore. Not revenge, not justice, not even grief. Just restore. Restore what I'd built with Ethan. Restore what I sacrificed. Restore who I was before she buried me under legalese and polite cruelty. I called Daniel the next morning. He was a probate attorney in Berkeley, married to my old co-worker Jess. We hadn't spoken in years. I didn't explain everything, just asked if we could meet. He said yes without hesitation. We sat at a corner cafe, and I showed him the documents. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him what I remembered, what I'd seen, what I suspected. He read in silence, then leaned back and said the words that made my chest tighten. "This isn't just suspicious. It's potentially invalid." I exhaled. Not relief, just confirmation. He laid out options: filing a contest, requesting a formal review of the signature, petitioning for restitution of marital property. It would take time, he warned. Months, maybe a year. Judith would fight it. There would be hearings, discrediting. "I can handle that," I said. "You'll need to relive a lot of things." "I already do," I told him. Daniel nodded like he understood something deeper. "Then let's begin." I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel brave. I just felt ready to stop pretending I didn't exist. And as I walked home that night, wind pressing against my collar, streetlights flickering above me, I realized I hadn't thought about Ethan's voice all day. I'd thought about mine. The court date came faster than I expected. It was a procedural hearing, just the beginning. Still, I couldn't breathe properly that morning. I wore a plain black dress and tied my hair back. No jewelry, no makeup. I wanted to look small, harmless, invisible even. Judith sat 2 rows ahead of me in her usual navy blazer, surrounded by her attorneys. They looked like a panel of windproof windows, cold, identical, unshakable. She didn't glance back, not once, but I knew she felt me there. People like her always do. They can sense when something doesn't kneel anymore. The judge reviewed the documents without expression. Daniel did the talking. He was precise, deliberate, never raising his voice. He pointed out the inconsistencies, the date on the signature, the decline in Ethan's mental capacity during that time, the absence of a neutral third-party witness. The judge didn't rule that day. It wasn't that kind of hearing, but he agreed to move forward. Judith stiffened just slightly. That was all I needed. When we stepped out of the courtroom, she turned to me for the first time in months. "You're wasting everyone's time," she said, her voice low and clipped. I smiled. Not out of joy, just muscle memory. "You took everything I said softly. Now I'm just asking questions." She stared at me like I'd spoken a language she couldn't translate. "You were nothing before Ethan." And yet I replied, "Here we are." She didn't respond, but I saw it, the flicker, the recognition that I wasn't standing where she thought I'd be, that I hadn't broken quietly the way she expected. That night I walked home in the rain. I didn't rush. I let it soak into my coat, into my hair, into the lining of my shoes. It felt like something was being washed off, years of silence, of stepping aside, of making myself smaller, to make room for people who thought I didn't belong. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. I was just done shrinking. Daniel called the next day. He'd found something, a revised deed transfer. It listed the house under a trust created just a month before Ethan died. Judith was the trustee. But here's the part that made my breath catch: the loan tied to that trust had recently defaulted. She was trying to flip the house. She'd borrowed against it after Ethan's death more than she could manage, probably assuming I'd vanish and she could resell it without delay. But she hadn't counted on me filing a claim. She hadn't expected the process to freeze everything: legal review, financial transitions, real estate activity. And now the bank was involved. The house was stuck. She couldn't move forward. She couldn't sell. She couldn't even refinance. It was poetic in a quiet, brutal kind of way. I didn't cheer. I didn't pour champagne. I just stared at the documents and let the silence stretch. She hadn't just pushed me out. She'd overplayed her hand. And now I had leverage. I took the next week off from everything, from thinking, from grieving. I walked to the library each morning, sat in the back with my laptop, and started looking into asset recovery, silent ownership, real estate shell companies. I wasn't trying to beat her. I was trying to build something she couldn't touch. A future with no hinges on her doors. There were nights I'd still cry. Not for Ethan. I'd already said goodbye to him 1,000 times. But for the version of myself I let disappear to make room for someone else's son. Someone else's legacy. Someone else's control. That version deserved mourning too. But not resurrection. I wasn't her anymore. Not the girl with clipped wings and careful words. Not the wife who waited outside hospital doors while decisions were made around her. not the placeholder in someone else's family tree. I was someone else now. And I wasn't done. People stopped calling, not that there were many to begin with, but the ones who'd sent flowers after the funeral or posted prayers under Ethan's obituary. They faded, one by one. Judith had a way of making silence contagious. She didn't need to say things outright. All she had to do was sigh, pause meaningfully, and let others fill in the blanks. That's how she worked. With whispers, with posture, with reputations built from carefully curated pity. She's suing the family, someone must have said. She's bitter, someone else replied. She's trying to take advantage now that he's gone. And no one questioned it. Because I didn't scream. Because I didn't fall apart in public. Because I wasn't a widow in the way they wanted me to be, fragile, weeping, dependent. I didn't fit their grief narrative, so I must have been doing something wrong. I ran into an old friend of Ethan's at the grocery store. We used to double date with him and his wife back before hospitals, and hospice became our social life. He saw me near the produce aisle and hesitated. Then he walked over too casually, like bumping into me was an inconvenience. I heard you're going to court, he said. No hello, no. How are you? I am. He gave a tight nod. You know Judith's really struggling. I didn't answer. She lost her only son. So did I wanted to say. But mine wasn't born from her body, so it didn't count. He walked away before I could find a reply. I stared at the apples for a while, trying to remember what I came in for. I went home with nothing in my cart. There were nights I doubted everything. What if I was wrong? What if I was selfish? What if Ethan had really meant to change the will? But then I'd read his texts. The ones from the last month he was lucid. The ones where he asked if I'd made tea, or if I could sit beside him while he slept, or if I remembered to pick up his favorite yogurt from the corner store. They weren't grand declarations. They weren't legal instructions, but they were full of trust. He never stopped seeing me as his home. So I reminded myself, this isn't about what Judith said, or what people believed, or what polite society expected from a widow who'd been erased from the paperwork. This was about truth, and preservation, and dignity. It was about not letting someone walk out of your life with everything you built and pretend you never existed. I couldn't go back to work yet. My old contacts had moved on. And to be honest, I didn't have the bandwidth to sit in meetings smiling at PowerPoints, like my life wasn't being cross-examined in courtrooms and gossip circles. So I started working on something else. I found a small business grant program for women in transitional housing. I didn't qualify yet, but the process of writing a plan, building numbers, pitching something, it gave me back a piece of myself. A part that had nothing to do with Ethan or Judith or legal documents signed in the dark. One morning I got a letter from the probate office. It was a notice the house had officially entered foreclosure. Judith's loan had collapsed under the weight of court holds and unpaid interest. She was losing the house I made a home, the house she stole with a pen and a lie. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something slower, something quieter. I felt the beginning of justice, not for Ethan. For me. When the house went into foreclosure, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even tell anyone. I just stared at the email for a long time, no subject line, no fanfare. Just a scanned notice from the bank, notice of default scheduled auction. Judith had over-leveraged it, trying to turn grief into gain. But when the estate got tied up in legal proceedings, the money she borrowed dried up. She couldn't sell, couldn't move, couldn't even negotiate with the lender without facing my challenge. That house, our house, was about to go up for public auction. And that was the moment I made my decision. Not to humiliate her, not to win, but to reclaim the thing I had poured myself into for 5 years. The floors I had mopped when Ethan was too sick to walk. The walls I'd repainted in soft sage green, because the chemo made him nauseous around bright colors. The bedroom I had slept in beside his failing body night after night, pretending each morning might be different. I wasn't buying a house. I was buying my way back into myself. Daniel connected me with a third-party real estate trust. It was clean, quiet, legal. The trust would place the bid on my behalf. My name would never appear in the paperwork Judith would eventually see. All she'd know was that a private buyer made a full cash offer during the auction and claimed the deed. The auction was held online. I didn't watch it happen. I went to the botanical garden instead. It was early April. The magnolias were in bloom. I walked slowly through the winding paths, breathing in air that didn't smell like bleach wipes or old paperwork. I sat on a bench near the koi pond and closed my eyes. By the time I got home, Daniel had texted me 3 words, "It's officially yours." I stared at those words, not blinking. I whispered them once under my breath, not because I needed to hear them, but because I wanted the room to know. 3 weeks later, the trust sent out formal notices to the existing occupant, Judith. She had 30 days to vacate or sign a lease. Through the trust, we offered her terms, market rate, no personal leniency. Just like any other tenant who couldn't afford to move quickly and needed a temporary option. The management company handled all communication. I never spoke to her. I never saw her. But I imagined her opening that envelope, reading the offer, realizing the house was no longer hers, and that she could only stay if she paid rent. Not to a stranger, but to the woman she called nothing. I didn't need to see her face. I didn't need the confrontation. That moment wasn't for her. It was for me. It was the moment I proved without a single scream or headline that I had not disappeared. I had not been erased. I had simply returned in a form she couldn't control. The next time I passed the house, I didn't stop. I didn't glance at the window where I used to sit with Ethan sipping weak coffee and watching birds gather on the power lines. I didn't slow down to see if Judith was still there. I just walked by, free. Because I no longer needed to live in that house. But she did. And she would on my terms. I never went back inside. Even after the deed was transferred. Even after the property manager confirmed Judith had signed the lease. I never crossed the threshold again. I didn't need to. That house had stopped being mine the day Ethan died. What I took back wasn't wood or paint or real estate. It was narrative. It was proof that I was never just the wife. That I hadn't imagined the sacrifices. That I hadn't made up the years I spent dissolving into someone else's emergency. She could live there now. She could watch her shows in the same living room I used to line with pill bottles and soft blankets. She could complain about the heating or call the management company when the plumbing failed. But she would never again call it hers. One afternoon, I walked past the house on my way to meet Daniel. It had been months. Spring again. The garden out front was still overgrown. Judith had never cared for plants the way I did. The gate squeaked the same way it used to. I could see a light on in the back den. And for a brief second, I wondered if she'd moved the furniture, if she'd thrown away the photos, if she'd scrubbed the house of any trace of me. But it didn't matter, because I didn't need to be remembered to matter. I sat across from Daniel at a small cafe near the courthouse. He handed me a thin folder final documentation. Everything wrapped up. The estate was settled, the foreclosure closed. The trust dissolved into a holding company under my name. No loopholes left. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "She's renting from you now," he said quietly. "How does that feel?" I stirred my tea. "It feels like gravity," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Not heavy," I clarified. "Just right. Like everything fell where it was supposed to. Eventually." We talked a little more logistics, next steps, things about paperwork I barely heard. I was already somewhere else, back inside myself. The day Ethan proposed, he told me I made him feel calm. He said I was like a harbor steady, quiet safe. I don't think I ever told him the truth. He was the one who made me brave. And now, even without him, I was learning to stand again. Not in defiance, not in vengeance, but in wholeness. I never responded to Judith's final notice, a complaint about the broken dryer. The property manager handled it. I didn't need to be part of her world anymore. I was done being reduced to legal terms and emotional debts. I wasn't a widow chasing scraps. I was a woman who remembered herself. That night I went home to my modest apartment, the one I'd furnished piece by piece without compromise. I lit a candle in the window, not for Ethan, not even for closure, just for the part of me that had finally come home. I didn't mark the anniversary of Ethan's death this year. There was no candlelight vigil, no visit to the cemetery, no long posts on social media about grief or survival. I just woke up, made coffee, and fed the stray cat that had started lingering near my window. The sky was gray, the wind sharp, but it didn't sting the way it used to. There's this myth that closure looks like a door slamming shut, or a courtroom win, or someone finally saying, "You were right." But that's not how it happened for me. Closure was walking past a house I once loved without flinching. It was paying the water bill for a tenant who would never know who I was. It was sleeping through the night without dreaming about hospital monitors or fake signatures. I never became wealthy. I didn't go on some glamorous rebirth tour of Europe. I didn't write a memoir or start a foundation or give a TED talk about betrayal and healing. I just started living again. I took a part-time role, consulting for a nonprofit I used to admire from afar. The first time I led a meeting again, my voice cracked. Not from nerves, but from hearing myself out loud after so many years of quiet. I planted basil on the windowsill. I took a class on grief and legal ethics at the community college. Not because I needed it, but because it made me feel sharper, more rooted in the world I once stepped away from. And sometimes, when I'm walking home and I pass people chatting on a front porch, or arguing over fence height, or watering their hydrangeas, I think about the woman I used to be. The one who would have traded everything for peace in someone else's home. The one who once believed proximity to love was the same thing as having a place in it. But I don't miss her. She's part of me. But I don't carry her weight anymore. I carry her strength. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to tenant of record. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a short note Judith had moved out. No forwarding address. No thank you. Just a scribbled line. Please handle final utilities. I stared at her handwriting for a long time. Then I shredded the letter and watered my basil. That was the end of her story in mine. And the beginning of mine in mine. No banners, no revenge plot twist. Just the quiet power of still being here and being whole.